Digital World, organized by Sri Vaishnav Vidyapeeth Vishwavidyalaya and International Simulation and Gaming Association ISAGA. It's a pleasure to inform that today we have with us Mr. Jawahar Bhalla, Principal, JB Engineering System, Sydney, Australia. Before beginning the webinar, I would like to welcome and introduce today's speaker of the webinar, Mr. Jawahar Bhalla. Mr. Jawahar Bhalla is a passionate system professional with experience across multinational organizations in technical and strategic leadership roles, delivering complex capabilities. He contributes to the advancement of system thinking, system engineering, and modeling and simulation locally and globally. Through leadership roles in peak bodies, including the System Engineering Society of Australia and Simulation Australasia. Currently, Mr. Jawahar Bhalla is a PhD candidate on an Australian government research training program with Industry Partnership Shoal Group at the University of Adelaide, Australia. Now, I request Mr. Jawahar Bhalla to enlighten us with his knowledge. There's a request for the audience. If you have any question during the presentation, please type them into the chat box or QA section. I will bring them up at the end of the presentation. We'll also have time for questions at the end. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mrs. Singh, much appreciated. I'm going to start sharing screens. Is my screen coming through okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Right, so if I could, Dr. Dubey, if you could run the first ball and I'll get started then.
Okay.
So if everyone could just have a quick answer of this poll, and it's just trust your gut instinct. Yeah. Okay. Great, we're getting quite a few responses. Thank you, that's excellent. Maybe give it a few more seconds and then we might stop that one and get started. So we're seeing some trends over here. Let's see. Okay, Dr. Dubey, I think that's a good number. So we can if you want to publish that poll, that's excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to start off. So given the current circumstances we find ourselves in today with COVID in particular, I was thinking about how to start this talk, and I used a couple of stories and I found one that sort of resonates. So I'm going to start with that. I might just, if this works. Right. So I want to take you back in time to the 1950s. There was an outbreak of malaria on the island of Borneo in Sarawak in Malaysia at that point in time. And this was when the World Health Organization just came into being. And so, the first call they made was WHO, help us, we have an outbreak of malaria, people are dying. The World Health Organization responded and their response was to spray DDT. Now, some of you might remember what DDT is if you're the same sort of vintage as I am. Pretty strong chemical. It does the job, and so it killed the mosquitoes, and everyone started to get better. But then, interestingly, two things started to happen after a while. The first thing that happened was the thatch on the huts of some of the villagers started to fall in. And then after a little while, there was an outbreak of the plague, typhus. And so once again, the people of Borneo, panicked and called out to the World Health Organization and say, we're in trouble again. Can you please help? The World Health Organization thought, gee, we just helped them out with malaria. Let's see what's going on this time. So they went over to Borneo with the team and had a look at what had happened. And what was really interesting was what they found. They found that they had actually been the cause of this second series of problems. So when they sprayed the DDT, they killed all the mosquitoes. But what they also did was, as a byproduct, they eliminated a particular species of wasp as well. That wasp used to be the main, feed on a particular type of caterpillar. And without the wasp to control the caterpillar population exploded, and the caterpillars loved the thatch on the house, on the huts. And so, they started to lose their roofs as a result of that. The second aspect of it, where people getting the plague, was more interesting. While the mosquitoes that died were eaten by the lizards, the geckos on the island. Now, they were very strong and they weren't affected by the DDT building up in their bodies. However, the cats that ate the geckos couldn't handle the level of toxin that was in the geckos. And so the cat population was almost eliminated. And so the rat population grew. And as a result of that, we ended up with the plague. So the interesting thing here is that we had good intentions, but unintended consequences. And that essentially is the essence of what systems thinking tells us in that regard. And there is a particular systems archetype that explains this behavior. And there are many systems archetypes, and I'll go probably through two, but here, this one is called fixes that backfire. We have a problem. We look at correcting by implementing a quick fix that just fixes the symptom, but not the true problem. So we get temporary relief. But then what happens after a point in time? Something else happens. We get unintended emergent consequences that make the original problem worse or make a bigger problem. By the way, you know how they solved this problem when they found out that they were the cause? This is an absolutely true story. You can look it up. They wanted to be as safe and natural as they could. So they parachuted cats into the island of Borneo. They got the Royal Air Force to do that, to get rid of the rats in a more biosensitive fashion. Another type of systems archetype is called shifting the burden, that we push the problem out to future generations. And in this case, we have a problem. Again, we can implement a quick fix, or we can have a fundamental solution. And there are two loops that happen as a result of that. The quick fix is easily implemented. However, it's just a band-aid solution. The actual permanent solution, we know what it is, but it takes more time and effort, and there is a delay usually associated with it, a cost delay as well as a time delay. And then what happens is we end up in a addictive cycle of quick fixes. So instead of fixing the real problem, we stay on fixing the symptom. But what happens is, as we continue to do this, the problem continues to get worse, and the quick fixes we have to apply get more and more. But what also happens is that while we're implementing these quick fixes, time goes on, and now we get other secondary effects and tertiary effects start to happen, which actually make it harder for the actual fundamental solution. I'm not going to into a lot of detail on this. There is a YouTube video I did on this if you're interested in looking it up, that I've got the link over there. But a classic example of this, for example, is when a company that is doing an engineering business, and you have developmental funds for R&D, and you cut back on that, and you find that your sales are dropping, so you put more funds into marketing. So marketing goes and sells products more. However, you're not putting it into R&D. So the amount of money available to R&D reduces, which further exacerbates the problem. A classic example of the shifting the burden is how we deal with global hunger and food shortages. So we give people food. We go out there and we distribute food to take away the problem of people going hungry. We don't go back and fix the actual fundamental problem. And then what happens after a time is that we get secondary problems happening. Mafias start to form that control the distribution of that food. Now to change it, it becomes even harder because now the mafias are in place. And if you look at India, for example, perhaps the biggest classic problem of quick fix, the partition of India, and how quickly that was done, Article 370 coming into play, and the implications of those fixes over generations to come. And systems archetypes such as shifting the burden explain this. Perhaps the most classic shifting the burden archetype is climate change. We look at how we continue to shift the problem onto future generations. When we look at the problems we face today, climate change and COVID are probably the two biggest ones. Are we understanding and dealing with these problems systemically, holistically? And what quick fixes are we implementing now that we'll pay the legacy for in the future? Dr. Dubey, if you could run the second poll, please, now, and while we're answering that second poll, I shall keep going. So, so if you could please just quickly see what you think about how we're dealing with situations we're in today. Are we dealing with them holistically? Are we doing it partially in that sense? Are we largely being holistic and looking at the bigger picture for future generations and making it a safer and secure society and world? Right. Perhaps, Dr. Dubey, keep it going for a few seconds more and I'll keep going. So, in that context, I want to contextualize what I'm going to talk about going forward. So I've touched on systems thinking and a very high level contextual definition, systems thinking. What is systems thinking? Peter Senge explains it as a conceptual framework. It's a body of knowledge that helps us understand and look for patterns so that we can then deal with change effectively. I've got my own personal definition, which is it's a conceptual framework that helps us understand and make sense of the world. And I use these two terms, efficiently and effectively, because I think that's fundamental, and also to create the reality we perceive. And I think systems thinking is fundamentally complemented by modeling and simulation. And I'm hoping to get that message across as we talk today. But really, why do we have systems thinking and why do we want to do this? I think fundamentally it's to understand answers to these three questions, right? What, how, and why. There are secondary questions that come on like when and by whom, but at the top of it, there are these three fundamental questions. And systems thinking provides a metaphor that is used so widely that I have found to be perhaps the most powerful metaphor there is, of the iceberg model. So the iceberg model is very simplistically, we can look at things at the surface, at events, at what is happening, and we can react to them. If we want to have more permanent, powerful solutions, we have to look below the surface. We'll start to look at patterns of behaviors, look for those patterns and then anticipate them and then correct the patterns. To get even more leverage, we can go even further down and look at architectures, understand how things work, how they're connected together, and we can design change and we can understand how we make a difference. But at the very lowest level, to get the maximum leverage, it's really about transforming something. And that comes down to mental models. Is the why things do what they do and why they behave the way they behave. And the interesting thing here is that if we look at the stuff below the surface in the iceberg model, the iceberg metaphor, it's all about models. It's about systems models and mental models. And really that's the context of how I want to structure this presentation. Is I want to very quickly talk about modeling and simulation to add from a definitional perspective that will set the context. I then want to jump across and talk about aircraft because I want to sort of centralize it about flight simulation. So talk about aircraft generations and how military defense aircraft in the main have evolved over time. And then jump across into flight simulation and explain the context of modeling and simulation in the flight context and how that has evolved. And then really come into the concept of mental models at the bottom of the iceberg. What is it and how do we actually create the reality that we live in and we're in? And then finish off with actually questioning the concept of reality itself and see what we think about that, hopefully into a discussion. So let's start off at the top. Modeling and simulation, conceptual definitions. And we could spend the whole day just talking about this. So I'm really going to be really brief here. Happy to answer questions later on. So straight into the definition, a model is a representation. It's an abstraction for a particular purpose of a physical, mathematical, or logical construct. The point over here is it depends what the perspective is, what the view is, but fundamentally it's an abstraction and representation. So if we take a simulation then, what is a simulation? It's really an execution of a model. So we take one or more models, we put them together and we execute them, and now something happens. So a simulation is an enactment of a series of models over time. And so if you have some examples of simulations, so on the left-hand side, we have an example of the planetary lander, which is a model of a vehicle over a model of terrain, and these two models are interacting in a simulation to see what happens. On the right-hand side, we have a model of a car that's going over a model of terrain and doing other things in a virtual representation in a computer-generated context. And we call the tool that does that, that implements that, the simulator. So a simulator really is a tool that executes the simulation which is an enactment of a model over time. And therefore, by definition, George Box puts it quite succinctly: all models are wrong, but some are useful, and it comes back to what the purpose of the abstraction is that makes the model useful. A bit more into it in terms of categorizing simulations, and in the context over here is training. So when we're looking at training people, or in a simulated context, we typically can categorize them using this two-dimensional approach of the participants in the simulation and the scenario environment within which the simulation is occurring. So we can have real participants in a real environment, and we call that live. So it's a live simulation when it's happening in a with real participants in a real environment. We might put real people in a simulated environment, and we typically call that virtual. A classic example of that is a flight simulator. We might have it all happening in a digital construct. It's happening in a computer generated, and we call that constructive. Simulated people in a simulated environment for a particular purpose. Or we might turn that around completely. We might simulate the human in an environment that is real to be able to do training. And typically that happens in the medical field. But think about crash test dummies, for example. You know, how do we test the forces on individuals in a car crash, for example? That's a classic example of that. And as we go get more good at this, we then start to blend these things together. So we get the blended construct of all of these different domains working together. And a classic example of that is in the virtual augmented reality construct, VR, AR, or XR, as sometimes it's called, where we're mixing each of these together depending on what the need is to augment the reality from a realism perspective. In a defense construct, we have a slightly different view of the same thing. It's where we're trying to connect things together in an integrated context, and we typically call it live, virtual, and constructive. I add the human bit on because that seems to get missed. And you typically hear about LVC or integrated ILVC in a defense construct. And fundamental to all of this, underlying all of this, we have to remember that all of this is about abstractions. It's about models that are abstracted for a particular purpose. We're trying to connect models together, and the concept of interoperability, how well they connect and what happens, and the concept of emergence, which is absolutely fundamental to reality and how we create that and systems thinking. But emergence is the result of connecting models together due to the fact that they're of different abstractions. Things happen that we'd never planned to happen. We get unintended emergent consequences. We'll come back to those factors as we go through the presentation in a bit more detail. I want to move into aircraft now, into aircraft generations. I think everyone's heard the term fifth generation. If you're in a defense context, you hear it quite frequently. You know, fifth generation aircraft. The F-35 is a classic example of a fifth generation platform, and there are a number of those. But what does fifth generation mean? Now, typically you think about things like the role that it plays, and they call it the fifth generation multi-role fighter. I mean, you look at the types of properties that the aircraft has. You know, it can go reasonably fast. It can go at Mach 1.6, as you can see over there. It has a reasonable range, 2,200 kilometers, and can go to a ceiling of 50,000 feet. But the fundamental difference about a fifth generation capability is on the right-hand side over here. This is what makes it different to any other aircraft type. And what that is fundamentally two things: stealth and sensor fusion. So this aircraft is now not detectable as easily because of the way its form is. And it uses its sensors in a different manner to any previous generation aircraft that existed before that. And I go to that in slightly more detail. So to explain fifth generation, I'm going to go through very quickly the generations that existed prior to the fifth. But examples of the fifth generation aircraft are the F-35, the F-22. There's a few other examples over there for reference. Inherently, they're bringing in this concept of stealth and sensor fusion. But let's go back to the start. What was generation zero? So generation zero was when we first started flying, and aircraft in defense started to use. So they were really just propeller-driven aircraft. So they could now go, they could do stuff that we couldn't do on the ground and on the sea, and you could go faster to places that you couldn't do before. And that was primarily it. You could go faster to places that you couldn't do before, and therefore you had the ability to do that, you could get away quickly. And some examples of that, and we're talking about the late 30s, early 40s, 50s, that type of time frame in that space. We then moved into the jet age. And again, exactly the same thing. It just went faster. You could just go faster somewhere. You weren't very sophisticated in terms of sensors. In fact, you had hardly any sensors on board. You didn't have any weapons. It was very basic. You could probably drop stuff, but that was it. We went on, technology got better, and we got supersonic, and now we got more sophisticated. We started to get more instrumentation, avionics. The aircraft could go faster, but they were inherently, they were still acting by themselves. They were getting out there to a target and coming back and doing it a lot quicker and doing it reasonably well. And you start to now recognize some of those aircraft that our generation has probably seen. And then we had a real architectural shift where we got really good at aerodynamics and really good at engines and performance and systems. And now we started to make multi-role aircraft where they didn't just get somewhere fast and back, but they could actually be a bit more maneuverable and they could perform multi-role. So they could be air to air, air to ground, air to sea. And they started to get a bit more in terms of their effectiveness and not just about their efficiency of going fast and coming back. And now we come into our current generation of the fourth generation of aircraft, and you'll start to recognize some of these. Hopefully, for example, the MiG-29, the Tejas, which is an Indian inherent design and creation, and the Mirage 2000, for example. These aircraft now became highly maneuverable. They required a different way to control them. And you couldn't rely on just controlling the aircraft with the stick and then taking your hand off the stick to go and touch buttons and to control dials. And they introduced new concepts such as hands-on throttle and stick, or HOTAS, H-O-T-A-S, the heads-up display, technologies that didn't exist before but were brought into play because these aircraft demanded it. They were highly maneuverable and they needed the pilot to be always hands-on and to fly the aircraft. They also became more sophisticated in their avionics and their sensors. You had radars and sonars and so on implemented in these things, and they got more sophisticated from that perspective. Between generation 4 and generation 5, there was an intermediate, which I call the generation 4.5. And what these aircraft were is they didn't change too much in terms of their aerodynamics and mechanical and flight properties, but they changed in terms of the avionics and sensors. What was the change? The computing technology had got better. And now we brought in sensor integration. So we started to connect sensors together to be able to improve the sensibility of the aircraft and its ability to perform its roles. The avionics systems got better. They could fly better. They had more performance characteristics, more safety factors, and they could push the envelope a bit more. And again, you're starting to see some of the aircraft that you should recognize over here. And that step to the 5th generation then was taking that capability and adding in sensor fusion and stealth. So let me explain the concept of sensor fusion a bit more. But before that, what we currently have in the main, most defense capabilities globally now are a mix between some third generation, which are being sort of faded out, but really it's a mix of 4, 4.5, and 5th generation, and now we're moving into the 6th generation capability. It's highly maneuverable, hands-on throttle and stick, sensor integration, sensor fusion, highly disruptive. But as you can see, that the training requirement for this capability also needs to evolve to be able to deliver that. Let me explain very quickly the difference between sensor fusion and what this capability is. So say we have these 3 different generations acting, 4, 4.5, and 5. And what we want to try and do from a defense capability is develop a common operating picture. What's happening everywhere so that everyone has a common approach of what's going on. And we do that through these 2 concepts. Between the 4th generation and the 5th, there's the concept of sensor integration, where we're integrating information across sensors. And between 4.5 and 5th generation and future capabilities is about sensor fusion. And the difference there, to try and explain this, is say you have 3 different types of sensors. Sensors A, 2 on 1 generation 4, 3 on 4.5, and 3 on the 5th generation. The fundamental difference over here is that on the 4th generation capabilities, the sensors are standalone, and we need to put a wrapper around it to integrate their information to get a common operating picture of what's going on. And each platform carries its own picture. The difference in the 5th generation and the 4.5 capability is that the sensors actually fuse the data that they have across everyone that has the same type of sensor. And so what that does is that, whereas previously, if you had a target, one aircraft was looking at it from here, that's what that aircraft saw. But now you have different platforms with a common sensor that are looking at the same thing from many different perspectives. That information is shared over a standard protocol. And each of those platforms has the same vision as all of them collectively together. So there's a difference in that paradigm of how it's done. And that is fundamentally the difference between the 4.5 to 5th and between the previous generation aircraft. So I want to jump into flight simulation. How am I going on time? Yep. Okay. So we go back to the early aircraft days. So this is about 1910. So the Wright brothers flew at about 1903 roughly. So now we're getting aircraft starting to first, getting a bit more sophisticated in a sense. So this was the Antoinette aircraft. You can see the name over there. Pretty popular early aircraft. But what's interesting is if you look at the controls on this aircraft, you see the two wheels on each side of the pilot. That's what they use to control the aircraft. So one of the wheels controls your pitch, whether you go up or down, and the other wheel controls the yaw, you go left or right. Now, as you can imagine, if you haven't flown this thing before, and the first time you sit in this aircraft and you're trying to fly it, you have to be really conscious of which hand does what. And if you're coming into land and there's a gust or there's a bit of a stressful situation, it's quite easy to get the wrong hand to do the wrong thing. Remember the days when you're learning how to drive and when you're trying to coordinate between one hand and the other hand, or the feet and the hands? And so we had lots of losses of aircraft and life. And so there was a need to be able to train in a simulated environment. Well, we didn't have technology and simulators then, or computing, but we had innovation and we had human spirit. And we had the first flight simulator that was born. Pure innovation, absolute genius, models abstracted to create a particular reality that allowed for training. The point was, what's the purpose? The purpose is to train your coordination, your muscle memory, so you know subconsciously which hand should go down left and which hand should take you left or right. You practice that a number of times so that you can do it in the real situation and not kill yourself or crash the aircraft. So I call that my Gen Zero. In a similar sense, as we go through the aircraft generations, we'll go through simulator generations. So these were purely mechanical. There was no sophistication of technology. But really, this was the first one, the Antoinette trainer. There also was a Sanders trainer, which was a glider that was sort of placed on a universal joint and in the wind, and you learned how to control it, limited capabilities. We then had the advent of analog computing. So we're talking about the late 30s, early 40s, coming into the 50s. And now we started to build a bit more sophistication in terms of the analog computing capability over there. The most classic example of that was the Link trainer up the top. But really what you notice over here is that the simulator looks like an aircraft, because you're trying to get into the people's mind that is an aircraft, but the simulation itself is nothing like an aircraft. It's very basic, really, really simple. And what they're talking about is a few dials and gauges that help you learn to fly without seeing anything. It's just about instruments. It's about learning how to control the instruments. The navigation train at the bottom was quite sophisticated, but again, it was essentially a replication of the sky with the stars on it, and you could change that and the guys could look at it and decide where they were. But the biggest change happened with the advent of digital computing in the 50s, 60s. And now we had the ability to do really high processing from a maths perspective in computers. We could actually create flight models and process them in real time. And really that was all we could do. And so we started to get more sophisticated in the fidelity of the flight modeling and to be able to generate feedback in terms of how flight was going. But as you can see, there was no realism of the environment. It was just about the flight model and about controlling the instruments. And then the big step happened in Gen 3 was the inclusion now of a virtual environment within which you were operating the aircraft. And we added in sound and motion. On the top, there's an example over here. What that is, it's a 3D replication on a wall of a particular area. And this was the visual representation of a Qantas flight simulator in Sydney of a rigid model. And when they practiced to land, they had a camera that went up and down this track over here that replicated the view of the pilot coming into land over this model board of where the airport was, so they could see where they were coming into land. And that was their visual simulation. That was their abstraction and model of the visual scene, and they learned to do that. We started to get a bit more sophisticated with dusk and night scenes. We didn't have the capacity or the capability of performance of computers to do full-blown reality as we see today. And the advent of the Stewart platform really brought it into its being with the 6th degree of freedom motion systems. From that point onwards, computing technology just Moore's law just went amazingly forward, and we got really sophisticated, and we started to build simulators that are now what we call the level D, zero flight time trainers, where they completely replicated the visual, what you see, what you hear, what you feel environment, to be the same as the real aircraft, so that you could then learn to fly on it and fly the aircraft first up without ever having to learn to fly on the aircraft. I've used two examples over here from my own career. So the one at the bottom was the first project that I worked on, was the C-130J, and it was in the late 90s, and we delivered the first level D certified flight simulator for the Air Force, and the KC-30 was above, and there's a few more beyond that. So this was where we got accreditation into simulation. We could now do a one-for-one mapping between aircraft and simulators. The next step then was to connect them together. Again, in the context of aircraft and avionics, remember we were trying to connect fourth generation, fifth generation together. And so we had to simulate that and try and connect them together. Now that proved to be a huge challenge because of the different architectures of the way simulators were done. And the first step in that direction was two standards, DIS and HLA, that came from IEEE. All these standards did were they allowed for simulators to connect and communicate state information. So one simulator would tell the other simulator where that platform was and its state information, its position, its velocity, what direction it was going in, that type of stuff. And you would then recreate that within that simulation, and now you had them connected together. But each of them had their own environment, their own simulated environment. They were not shared. And as you can guess, the sixth generation or the fifth generation was to connect that together, but actually to be able to share common environments. So you were actually flying in the same area and everything was correlated. And this is where this concept of interoperability came into being, and a new standard evolved for common synthetic environments, the common database format, of that you could share this across simulators and simulations. In a similar vein, most defense forces of today have simulators of these varying generations. Typically, they're in the Gen 4, they focus on individual flight training, but more and more there's been a push to get into team and tactics training and to mission rehearsal to connect them together. I want to jump a little bit into the architectures of simulation and simulators from a reference perspective, so you understand what the challenges are when we try and connect simulators together. At a very conceptual level, we could look at a simulator to be made up of these four subsystems. So we have the aircraft simulation, the platform itself. So we're simulating the airframe, the avionics, any weapons, any sensors that might have. So we have subsystems that simulate that. We simulate the environment that it operates in, the natural man-made environment and the tactical environment in that regard. We have to have an instructional capability that interfaces into that simulation that can change scenarios and create what's needed from a learning perspective. And we have some enabling supporting subsystems, the technology and the enabling infrastructure, networks, and so on that you need to support that. This is a very high level of conceptual, but the point over here that I'm trying to make over here is that when we put a simulator together, it's an integration across all of these subsystems. So we're modeling these systems and we have to integrate them together so they work holistically together. Now, the challenge happens when we try and connect simulations together. What are we actually trying to do? And this is where it gets interesting and complex as well. So when we connect simulators together, what we're actually doing is we're trying to connect it at the subsystem level. We have to have consistency and correlation at the subsystem level. And that's what's evolved in the generations that have come. So for example, the avionics and airframe, the modeling fidelity, how do we ensure that we develop consistency in terms of the models and the simulations we produce? And there's a standard for that. It's the Flight Simulation Accreditation Standard, and it focuses very much on the airframe and the avionics. And that's what the Gen 4 simulation was all about. They complied with this accreditation standard, so you built a fidelity that met performance requirements. IEEE came along and developed the standards of DIS and HLA when we started to connect them together, and we wanted to share where they were in the world and what their state information was. But then we wanted more than that. We wanted to have the common environment. We wanted all fly in the same common environment, and that's when the CDB, the Common Database Format, came into being, which I mapped into the Gen 5, and that was from the OGC. The Open Geospatial Consortium was the supporter for that particular standard. Now, we also have the ability to make common capabilities from an instructional enabling environment, but they're more efficiencies of scale and scope as opposed to standards in that regard. But the challenge really lies in these areas, the sensors, the weapons, and the tactical environments. There is no standard in place for this, and so everyone does it differently. And this is where the challenge arises when you try and connect these together. There is also a significant challenge when it comes to command and control, and then the governance frameworks. When we connect multiple simulations together, if they're done differently, how do we assure the integrity? How do we ensure correlation and consistency of content? So really, if we're talking about effective interoperability, to be able to do stuff collectively together in simulation in a defense context, we're talking about all of these things. And we need an architecture, a software and a hardware architecture that is efficient for reconfigurability. You want to be able to change this very quickly, to change the operational environment, to change the configurations of the platforms and the weather, the world, and to do that in different formats. So we want a standards-based, service-oriented architecture to enable us to do that. And if you look forward at where the next generation of simulation is going to go, it's primarily in these two areas. It's behavior, sensor fusion, weapons. Another word for that is AI, machine learning. That's where that needs to go, and the standards for that. And if you come back and look at that picture of that categorizations of sin, so what we're trying to do when we move into this space of integrating modeling and simulation together in defense context is we're integrating this stuff together. And fundamental to this is that interdependence, the interoperability that goes with it. And if you have to look at a conceptual reference of how this happens, we're talking about two things, about the vertical integration of these subsystems and about the horizontal fusion across the capabilities in exactly the same way that the 5th generation fighter capability brings in sensor fusion. We've got to mimic that in the simulation environment to do that. Okay, so moving on now and applying some of these concepts to mental models. So if you recall, we looked at the metaphor of the iceberg and how really to understand systems, we have to understand models because everything is a model. And so I'm going to go to talk a bit more now, specifically at that thing at the very bottom, right? Mental models, because this is the most fascinating area there is from a personal perspective. So when you think of mental models, have you ever come across this where we go into a meeting and we think we've all agreed and we all go away with different perspectives and different things, and we end up with actual disagreement? Or there's the very obvious one, you know, one person sees one thing, another person sees other. And then there's this one where just one person can see two different things from the same picture. And this one really took me away for a bit. And it's actually quite disconcerting. When you look at it once, you see one view, and you look at it again, you see a different view. But it just goes to show, right? What we see, what we think is real can be very different depending on our perspectives. So what are mental models? Peter Senge actually is probably has the best definition of mental models. He defines them as these deeply ingrained assumptions, generalizations, or even the images of that influences how we see and understand the world as they are. Umberto Maturana talks about the Santiago theory of cognition, how the living thing interacts with its environment to bring forth a sense of awareness. He coined the term autopoiesis, self-creation. And the point he makes, and by the way, really sad to know that he actually passed away last year. He's an amazing guy. If you're looking for some insights into human behaviors and mental models, he's a great read. So autopoiesis, self-creation. He says we create the world that we live in. And so how do we do that? I'm going to go through something that I'm sure you all know, but as we're going through this, I'm going to go through two examples, but apply it to your own context and see how it would apply if it does apply. So at the very base level, when we first come across something, it is meaningless. So say if you're learning a language for the first time, or say you're learning to fly. So the first time you hear a language, it's all sounds, different sounds. They don't mean anything. That you just start to mimic the sounds. Just as when you're learning how to fly, you've never seen an aircraft before. It's got wings, it's got all these buttons and gauges and sticks. You can see all this stuff, but you don't know what it means. It doesn't mean it's just stuff there at this point in time. You start to process that, and you start to establish relationships between it. You take sounds and you start to link sounds together. And when these two sounds go together, they make a word. And when you link these two words together, they actually have meaning. You establish a relationship between the knobs on a particular piece of equipment, and you learn that one turns it on, the other changes the frequency, and so on a radio. And you start to understand in terms of a description of what it is. And we call that information, really. So your mental model is starting to build up from something that meant nothing into something now that has some relationships. We then start to use this stuff, and we start to understand how it works. So the radio in an aircraft, you understand how to use the radio, turn the volume on, change the frequency, and actually talk to someone and communicate. When we're learning a different language, now we start to construct. We understand the grammar, and we can start to construct sentences, and we can see how things fit together. We're building up the abstraction of the model of what the language is, of what the aircraft is. And that transforms that information into knowledge. Now we know how to do it. And as we continue to do it, we start to understand why. So we start to understand why in a certain context, one word in one language can mean a completely different thing in the same language. It's just how it's used, how some languages have an adjective before the word and others put it after the word. And we start to then use that. And as we start to do this, our efficiency gets better. We get more efficient at doing it through our learning. We add value to whatever we're doing. We start to do stuff systematically. And then there's an almost understood or realized change that happens as we start to apply this knowledge in an environment by doing. We start to practice this stuff and we start to realize what works and what doesn't work. We turn efficiency into effectiveness through our wisdom by doing in an environment. That fundamental shift and that difference between knowledge and wisdom is the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And really, we need to have both. So we build up models and we get more efficient as the abstraction of our models gets richer. And then we apply those models in an environment and we learn what works and what doesn't work. So we validate the models and we start to know which models are good and which models are bad. And now we can extrapolate and say which models we would use in a particular situation and which ones we don't. And you know what's absolutely amazing is simulation is the only competency that exists that allows us to do both. Nothing else exists that allows us to transform knowledge into wisdom. We learn, but to actually transform it into wisdom, we have to apply it in an environment. And simulation is the one thing that allows us to do that without actually doing it in a real environment. And it's probably the most powerful profession there is in that regard in terms of what that allows us to do in that space. So one quick look back into the iceberg model, and just for reference, so we have this continuum of data, information, knowledge, understanding, wisdom, and iceberg model. If you just sort of turn this around and look at the other way, you'll start to see a correlation. I think is pretty phenomenal. Do you see now how that transformation, that wisdom is fundamental because it drives everything? It drives behaviors, it drives architectures, it drives essentially the world we see today is the result of the mental models that existed in the past that have created the reality that we're in today. And the thing is, it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, it will always create the reality. It's what our mental models are that create the reality we're in. Okay, so I want to almost towards the end. I see the time's also moving fast, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. So what is reality? How do we create it? So we talk about mental models and abstractions and so on and how we go through this. But if you look at our brain itself, right, how do we think? And hopefully you start to see this. So we have the left brain, which is we typically call the analytical bit. But this is how we create reality. We analyze stuff. We look at the detail. We take a system. We break it down to its parts. We understand the parts. We understand the relationships between the parts. We aggregate that up into our understanding of the system. That explains to us how things work. It's architectural. It's about organizational interdependence within the system. It tells you what the system does and how it does it, but it doesn't tell you what the system needs to do. To understand what anything needs to do, we actually have to look outside the system. We have to find how it fits into whatever systems it's a part of, whether it's a human or a piece of technology. To understand what a system does, it needs to be fit into and it's about the big picture. It's about how it fits into that operational context that it exists in, its operational interdependence. And then we understand completely what a system must do, not just what it does. But then there's still the why question. Neither of these methods answer the why questions. For example, we can understand how a car is built in terms of its architecture. We can understand what it does, but just by synthesis analysis, it will not tell you why the steering wheel in one place is on the right-hand side or why it's on the left. To do that, we need a third method, and that method is, as I call it, genesis. We have to look backwards and forward its time. We have to look at the heritage of the system. Literally, it's genetic and traditional heritage, and its architectural and technological heritage. And we have to look at its aspirations. What's its purpose? Where is it going? And these three aspects together fundamentally build up the models of reality that we perceive, or any reality that might exist out there. This is why we get different perspectives on different things, because we each see the world differently. And Humberto Maturana went on to say, we don't perceive the world we see the world we perceive. Every single one of us has a different reality of what's out there. So everything we consider to be true is an abstraction, is a model of that which we believe to be the truth. We've abstracted that based on our perceptions, our learnings, our experiences. And so another way to look at it, and this graphic absolutely says it very succinctly, is the truth exists somewhere. We have a perspective of that we establish through the models that we create of that reality. And we say that is true. And the problem happens when we think that what we believe to be true is the truth, and we start arguing about who knows what the truth is. And we say, my truth is better than your truth, and we start to get these challenges. René Descartes summed it up. He says, I think, therefore I am. And it's the thinking that makes that. And the question I came back to ask, then if that's the case, then who am I? And so if we have to translate in who am I, then if you look at this context, well, I'm an abstraction of that reality that I've created. So who am I? I really am my heritage, my environment, my relationships, and my aspirations. And you take any of these things away, and I don't exist anymore. I exist because of that. It's the reality that I have created. Our mental models really form our belief systems. Every decision, every choice we make is a simulation of our mental models. We feel something and we make a choice based on that. So the question is, are we living in a simulation? Well, that's not saying that. What it's saying is, the question perhaps is, where is the simulation? And clearly, so there's a simulation in us. But is that the limit? If you look at if you look at this perspective, say you were in a two-dimensional world. So you lived in a square world and someone lived in a two-dimensional circular world. So all our rules were square rules on this side, all our rules were circular rules on this side. How would we know that there was more than that? How would we know that reality is not just square, or how would we know reality is not just circular? Well, we would extend the limits of the reality of a model that we know. We would go to the edges. And what happens when we go to the edges? When we go to the edges, we find that the model changes. We now find that what we thought was true is not true anymore, and we get to a middle area in that. And so the question we ask is that what we're seeing in the reality that we perceive today? Well, let's think about it. We look at Newton's law of gravitation. It describes the world that we know on a large scale. So we can calculate the forces of planets, we can calculate the forces of parts of things, and we have a formula to do that. So we understand that part of the world. But then we look at quantum mechanics. We look at the Schrodinger equation of collapsing a wave into a point. And we have a different theory, a different truism. But what happens when these two theories come together? They don't blend. What is that telling us? I think it's telling us that what we think is the reality that we perceive through our senses, that model, is actually just another model that is abstracted to fit into our time-space continuum, into our time-space reality. What if it's a fractal pattern? That we have a simulation in our minds, the reality around us is a simulation, and in fact, it just go on. Are we able to tell whether we are in which simulation and whether there is even further simulations beyond that? I want to finish off now just to recap very quickly. Just remember the iceberg model of how we think, of really the transformation comes with the mental models. And really to finish off with the question of, are we in a simulation? Dr. Dubey, if you could launch the last poll, and I might finish up over there. With the questions to everyone, really, is there a simulation in us? Are we in a simulation? What is reality? Are we in a fractal pattern, and is all models and simulations and systems around us? I might stop over there and hand back to, I guess, Rani, to you. Thank you so much, everyone. And please, if you could, I'd love to see what your thoughts are on the poll questions, and we can go into a discussion.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It was such an erudite session. You nicely explained how gaming, modeling, and simulation will underpin our safe passage through these fast-changing, exciting, yet challenging times after the pandemic. So now this is the time for question and answer. Mr. Bhalla is available for the same. You may go ahead and ask your questions now.
I had one question to Mr. Bhalla.
Yes.
Since I work in the area of biology, you started with biological examples for your
Yes.
simulation, and then you went to aircrafts. But uh, in biology, at least, what happens is that we cannot work out all the consequences. We cannot fully simulate. Say, for example, even the consequences of, for example, in the ozone depletion could not be fully simulated because when these chemicals like refrigerants were found, nobody could imagine that will it how it is going to affect in the long term.
Mhm.
So, do you believe reality is a kind of a time bound thing that
I absolutely do. I absolutely do. I think that was the point I was trying to make at the end. I think our reality that we perceive is actually bound by space-time, as Einstein put it. And I might get controversial, but I'll say I think consciousness sits outside of that space-time, and our physical reality is contained within that space-time. So what we can sense is really space-time. So we can sense 3 dimensions and we can sense time, and we're limited by our physical senses to do that. So for example, what we see is limited by the sensitivity of our eyes, the rods and cones that we have, and the frequency range that those rods and cones are able to gauge. Now we know that we can shift that frequency in technology and create night vision goggles, for example, and sense stuff outside of that frequency on both sides of it. We know, for example, that animals can hear at higher frequencies than we can hear between our 20 and 20,000 kilohertz range. And we also know that because we have 2 sensory organs for hearing, that we can hear not just frequency and amplitude, but we can also sense direction because we have 2 of those. Now, if we only had 1 ear, we wouldn't be able to sense direction. But that doesn't mean direction doesn't exist. It's just that we can't sense it. And so I think we are inherently limited by our physical senses in this time-space continuum. But what we're seeing is that if we actually look at the laws that define that they are actually abstractions in their own right. And if that's the case, there is a deeper reality that sits beyond that we aren't able to. But within this time-space reality, we're also limited. We are essentially limited by our physical senses. And so if we want to simulate certain aspects or create models in order to create a model, you have to be able to sense that model to be able to abstract it. And so in a sense, we are, what's the word? We are limited in that space to what we can sense to be able to create those models. And then we use trial and error to extend them beyond that and to see what happens. And I think in biology, it's probably one of the greatest areas for that emergence of learning, because it takes you outside of what our limited senses are, because you can start to see in the natural world things that our senses don't tell us through extrapolation. So I didn't really answer your questions, but I think
that's right. Because biology, as you say, is so complicated. Now we have one immediate example. For example, COVID-19. All the predictions, because it's a biological organism which is mutating so fast,
yes.
that no predictions can be correct. You can't even predict, say, for the next 2 months, how is it, how the impact is going to be, or how is it going to spread in an area. Because you have no idea how it's going to mutate.
Yes.
And we only know that it can mutate. But
exactly.
After the mutation, only we can analyze it. What happened to
True.
the structure.
True. Yeah, no, exactly. And the only other point I would make is to go back to that metaphor of the iceberg model, is that what we can look for, that metaphor provides a reference frame that would help. So for example, we can start to look for patterns. We can look for patterns like we're seeing the waves that are happening in the various countries of how COVID is being taken up. We're looking at what people are doing. And based on those patterns, we might be able to predict what could happen. But the further we predict, the greater the variance becomes, or the less the probability of getting it right is. And I think applying that construct is that what we don't want to do is to just react. What we want to do is to try and look for patterns, look for architectures, look for mental models that are driving these things, and use that to the extent that we can. And that's why the competency and of the recognition of mental models, of having a frame of reference. I think the point that Alexander talked about, that every game is a frame game, right? That there is an architecture to this stuff. And if we can use that, we can actually start to use it, not just to learn, but almost to predict in a sense by using those techniques. So it's a fascinating world, and it's a fascinating area to be in this space of modeling and simulation and systems. Yeah.
Okay,
and by the way, if anyone else wants to add a point, please feel free to. This is a really a general thing that, and it's a learning exercise. I have learned tremendously from sitting into the previous lectures, and I'm sure there are lots of people with perspectives that help us all learn. Yeah. Are there any questions that are on? I haven't looked actually. Sorry, I should be looking. Were there any questions in the chat that were waiting to be answered or looked at?
In Q&A, only one question is there. That is, how mentally simulation connected with us?
Okay, I think the point that I was trying to make is I actually believe if you believe that a model is an abstraction of reality, and that everything that we have learned is by definition therefore a model. So we have models in our minds of what that reality is. That every time we think, we are simulating those models. We are creating a simulation of all the models that we have of reality, and we are projecting. We're making a projection to what outcomes might exist. And based on that projection of that simulation, we make a choice. And that choice is based on how we feel based on the outcomes that we've had. And they are really biased by our experiences. And everyone is biased. We're biased by the models that we have based on our traditions, our upbringing, our learning, our experiences. And we bring that bias into that. And that's where the simulation, the connection happens. It's in the simulation of those models. And each of our models is different.
That's the limitation with which we need to work, right? Our biases.
Absolutely. It's the recognition, it's the awareness of that biases that is fundamental. Because a lot of the times we don't even realize that we have a bias, because we think that reality is the reality that we perceive. And when we recognize that that's not the case, it actually makes us more humble as well as compassionate, because then you realize that the truth that I have is actually just true. It's not the truth. It's true. It's true for me. We have any?
I think there are some interesting observations in the chat, Dr. Jignasu. I saw just a reference to some book there.
Yes. Dr. Alexander.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jawahar, for this very nice talk and connection of simulation and mental models. And you already brought the keyword in. It's about the bias, right? And it's so interesting to learn about our biases. And well, I just had to cite the book from Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, a classical textbook for getting to know us better.
Thank you, Alexander. Great point. Yes. Yeah, I know that I'm really bad at thinking fast. I'm more a slow thinker person. I've got to step back and let it sit. Yeah.
It could also be that you don't know that you are also a very good fast thinker.
True. Could be. I'm still. Maybe I'll learn that one day. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. It was really amazing.
Thank you, Alexander.
Dr. Mandal? No questions? Dr. Sharma?
I think it was a great presentation. Very good. Really loved it.
Dr. Toshiko?
Thank you very much. Very good. Very good. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So no questions now. So Rani, please proceed further.
Yes, sir. So question answer session is over. Now I would like to request Dr. Vinod Damblekar, founder, Mentis, to present word of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Devi, you made me, with all those scientific and very learned references, such as Senge and others, you made me recall Archimedes, Heisenberg, to some extent. I remember Archimedes said that give me a place to stand and a lever, and I can shift and I can move the earth or move a planet. That suggested that you require two things. One, to understand the other. Therefore, if you don't have the other, you are immersed in your own prejudice, which we politely call bias. I suspect some of the participants would also know what Heisenberg said about moving objects, where he said that I can tell you where the object is, but I can't tell you at what speed it is moving, and vice versa. That you can describe only one of the two. Which means I think this is a world of twos. Unless you have both of them, you can't evaluate yourself. You don't know whether you're thinking. Fast or slow is a different or a third perspective. Thanking you is going to be an understatement today. You covered a number of topics. The presentation was awesome. You took us on a flight on an F-35 or fifth generation aircraft and brought us down to earth with more mundane but very interesting things like our bias and our prejudice and our ways of thinking. Now, I don't know, am I thinking right? I'm going to think back and find out whether I'm thinking at all. Your reference to the flight simulators made me recall September, I think, or August 2009. That was ISAGA in Singapore. The host took us, we were just about 7 or 8 of us. We were taken to a Boeing simulator where we had about, I think, 6 or 8 of these huge pods, something as large as a room, which replicated the pilot's space. And I had the unique opportunity to fly a Boeing 737 and bring it down to Changi Airport. I don't think many of you have done that, and that's very, I'm the first flight simulator, I think, at least here in India. It was fun, and I have a photo to prove it. Thank you for taking us deep, sideways, into our minds, and to understand things as forgotten as humility and perhaps tolerance. It was a wonderful presentation. We didn't realize that simulations could go this far, that we could borrow from actual sciences like Senge's and did you mention Descartes? Maybe that was good. But I remember believing is seeing, which keeps reminding me that what I say may not be true. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I wish that you would come and enlighten ISAGA, other simulators and games here, and other Indians sometime whenever you are free at our future sessions. To all others who have been here for a long time listening to KP's presentation, I'm sure you would have loved it. Thank you for being here. At last count, I saw 274 number of participants who are logged in and listening to you. So that's an exciting number. There are many more on YouTube as well. My thanks are also due to people like Dr. Guru Prasad and others who constantly ask questions and keep us excited about the answers that come from the speaker. And others who have come here regularly. Toshiko Kikawa is probably close to 100% attendance every time. Thank you, Toshiko, for being here. And Alexander. Alexander, I wish we had discovered you earlier. And of course, the great team behind this event, that is the Sri Vaishnav Vidyapeeth, Vishwavidyalaya. Many people are not here. I don't know whether the Vice Chancellor is logged in. I can't see him here. He is absent because he's busy with something else. But the fact that many of the faculty members are here, including, well, I will not name them because the exclusions will feel bad. Thank you for making this happen. It's been exciting, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With this, we came to an end of one more milestone of ISAGA webinar. Thank you everyone for joining with us. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Devi.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vinod. I'll email you the PDF shortly, Vinod.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay then.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Guru Prasad. Dr. Guru Prasad.
Thank